In a dry gully in eastern Oregon, a retired man is stacking rock by hand into a creek that hasn't run year-round in 100 years. Engineers warn him the rock will choke the channel and kill the fish. There's just one problem with that warning. The creek has no fish. It barely has water. 10 inches of rain a year fall on his 140,000-acre ranch, and most of it vanishes into cracked sand before summer. He isn't an engineer. He fixed pets for a living, and the pile of rock he's building is about to bring the water back. His name is Scott Campbell, and if you're picturing a weathered old cowboy, adjust the picture. Campbell is a veterinarian, not the military kind, the animal kind. He built Banfield Pet Hospitals into a chain of around 750 clinics before he sold out in 2007, walked away wealthy, and came home to the high desert near Burns, where his grandparents had ranched and his father had been the town doctor. He bought a defunct spread of more than 200 square miles as an investment. Then he actually looked at it. The land was in far worse shape than he'd expected. The valley bottoms, the parts that were supposed to be the good ground, were dry sagebrush and juniper. The creeks were gullies. Water tore through them for a few weeks each spring when the snow melted, then disappeared underground and left cracked sand behind. To a cattleman, this is a slow financial bleed. Cattle need water and forage in July and August, not just April. Campbell had bought a ranch where the best land quit producing halfway through the season. Here's the thing everybody assumed, including him at first. They assumed this was just what eastern Oregon looks like. High desert, sagebrush sea, 10 inches of rain. What did you expect? That assumption was wrong. And the reason it was wrong is the whole story. The creek was not dry because the sky stopped delivering. The creek was dry because the land had lost its ability to hold what the sky delivered. That's a completely different problem, and it has a completely different solution. The water wasn't missing. The water was leaving too fast. To understand why, Campbell did something most ranchers don't. He read. He's a self-described obsessive reader of frontier history, and he went digging into the journals of Peter Skeen Ogden, one of the most prolific fur trappers to ever work the West. Ogden came through this valley in the early 1800s, at least 3 separate times, and Ogden's journals described a place that sounds like science fiction if you're standing in the sagebrush today. He estimated the catchment held somewhere near 200,000 beavers. 200,000. Stop and picture what that means. Not a few beavers in a pond. An entire valley engineered top to bottom by rodents that never stop working. Their dams backed water up across the flats. The ponds slowly filled with silt. The silt became meadow. Water didn't rip through in a spring flood and vanish. It spread sideways, soaked in, and seeped out slowly all summer long, keeping the springs alive into the fall. The whole valley worked like a giant sponge, and the beavers were the animals squeezing and refilling it. Then the trappers came, and they were thorough, brutally thorough. There was even a strategy to it. The British, who controlled the region at the time, deliberately wanted to strip the beaver out and create what they called a fur desert, a wasteland with nothing worth coming for, to discourage American settlers from pushing in. So the beavers were removed almost completely. And what happened next is the part nobody was around to witness in slow motion. The dams, with no one to maintain them, decayed and blew out. Once the dams were gone, the water had nothing slowing it down. It cut. It carved straight down into the soft valley floor, gouging deep channels, and every one of those channels became a drain. As the creeks dropped, the water table dropped with them. The wet meadows dried out. The springs that used to run all summer went quiet. Sagebrush, which likes it dry, marched down off the hillsides and took over the valley bottoms. And that took about a century. Which is why, when Campbell later described the transformation of his own ranch, he kept coming back to one detail. The land had been degrading for roughly 100 years, and yet, in his words, the biggest surprise was that it comes back so fast. But he didn't know that yet. First, he had to fail. Because the obvious move, once you understand the beavers built the sponge, is to bring the beavers back. Just reintroduce them. Let the animals do the work they did for 10,000 years. It doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is a trap so clean it's almost cruel. Beavers need deep water to survive. They need it to hide from predators, to store food, to protect their lodges. Deep water requires dams, and dams out here require beavers. On top of that, beavers eat and build with riparian vegetation, mainly willow, and 100 years of a dropped water table had scoured most of that willow out of the valley. So you'd be dropping an animal into a dry gully with no deep water to hide in and nothing to eat. It doesn't restore the system, it just dies. This is the paradox at the center of the whole thing. The system needed the exact condition it was supposed to create. It needed deep water to make deep water. It needed willow to grow willow. Every piece depended on another piece that was already gone. The valley was locked out of its own recovery, and it had been locked out for 100 years. Nature couldn't fix it because the tool nature used to fix it had been taken away. So Campbell didn't try to rebuild the valley. He wasn't trying to recreate 200,000 beavers. He was trying to do one thing: break the loop. Give the system enough of a head start that it could take over from there. His tool was rock. He took rock off his own hillsides and started building what he calls artificial beaver dams. If you saw one, you might not even register it as restoration. They look a lot like the low rock road crossings you'd find on any ranch. Loose rock, dirt, gravel, sometimes logs, piled low across the channel. Crude, cheap, nothing an engineering firm would put its name on. And that's exactly why the experts were skeptical. Rock dumped in a stream is the kind of thing that normally gets you a warning about blocking fish and smothering habitat. Which brings us back to that beautiful contradiction from the very beginning. They were worried about the fish. There were no fish. The creek was a seasonal wash of moist sand for most of the year. You cannot block fish passage on a creek that has no fish, and for 10 months, barely has water. Here's why the crude rock worked when live beavers couldn't. A beaver dam and a rock dam do the same physical job. They slow the water down. That's it. That's the whole trick. When you slow the spring snowmelt, instead of letting it race through the gully, the water has time to do something it hadn't done in a century. It spreads sideways. It soaks into the ground. It percolates down into the old riparian soils instead of scouring past them. The rock dam ponds water up behind it, and because it's loose rock, it doesn't just stop the flow like a concrete wall. It lets the base flow leak through and continue downstream slowly. Build a series of them down a valley, and you've got a string of ponds that look and behave a lot like the real thing. The difference is, the rock doesn't need to eat. It doesn't need deep water to survive. It doesn't die. It just sits there, patient, doing the one job the beaver used to do, until the conditions come back that a real beaver could actually live in. The trick was never force, it was leverage. Campbell touched the single load-bearing point of a broken system, and then he got out of the way. Then the desert did something nobody alive had seen there. The water table came up, and as it came up, the native grasses that used to grow in these bottoms came back on their own. Nobody planted them. The seeds had been waiting. The rising water started drowning out the sagebrush, and where there had been gray brush and bare dirt, thick green meadow filled in. On one stream, Camp Creek, Campbell built more than 100 of these rock structures along about 3.5 miles of channel, and the valley bottom that had been just as dry and flammable as the hillsides around it turned into wet meadow. Now watch the payoff stack up, because this is where the numbers stop looking small. Remember, the whole reason a cattleman cares is summer forage. His livestock manager, Colby Marshall, described the practical result plainly. On ground that used to be marginal, they could now cut hay in the late spring and still graze cattle into the late summer. That's the season Campbell had been losing. He got it back. The restoration didn't compete with the cattle business. It fed the cattle business. And the creek itself? The gully that used to flow for a few weeks a year now runs year-round. It went from a dead wash to a permanent stream, which means that creek the engineers were so worried about killing the fish in, the creek that had no fish, filled up and started supporting fish. Many species of them. The rock didn't kill the fish. The rock is the reason there are fish at all. That's the punchline, and it's worth sitting with because it flips the entire premise. The intervention people feared would destroy the habitat created the habitat. You might be thinking, fine, but couldn't this just be luck? One lucky creek in one wet stretch of years? No, because Campbell didn't stop at one. He started replicating it across other valleys on the ranch, and he kept getting the same result. Water table up, grass back, sagebrush drowned, meadow thick. When the same simple action produces the same outcome valley after valley, that's not luck. That's a mechanism. And it wasn't just Campbell's word for it. This caught the attention of outsiders. The U.S. Forest Service documented the Silvies Valley Ranch as a case study in using artificial beaver dams to combat incised streams on rangelands. Their framing was almost dry. Local innovation against a global problem, a landowner mimicking beavers to reconnect streams with their floodplains and boost the quantity and quality of wet meadow, all with no change in where the cattle grazed. A river science professor from Duke, writing for the research group PEERC, walked through the whole story in detail. The neighbors noticed too. Ranchers nearby started experimenting with the same rock structures on their own land. One rancher from outside Paulina reached out just to ask how Campbell had pulled it off. That's the proof ladder, rung by rung. He saw the change, his own crew saw it in the cattle, it got measured in miles of stream and permanence of flow. Outside agencies and researchers confirmed the pattern, and then it spread beyond the fence line. This is not one man's hopeful story about his own land, it's a repeatable result other people are now copying. And then came the part nobody had promised. In 2015, a controlled burn on the ranch got loose. It escaped and it ran, eventually scorching more than 5,000 acres. During peak fire season, a loose fire in dry sagebrush country is exactly the nightmare you'd expect. It moved toward Camp Creek, the same stretch where Campbell had built his 100-plus rock dams, and the fire hit the wet valley and died. The restored meadow, green and soggy where it used to be dry brush, wouldn't burn. The fire couldn't jump it. That strip of restored creek became an accidental fire break, and it stopped the fire from taking many more acres and a number of buildings. Campbell had set out to grow summer grass for cows. He'd accidentally built fire insurance. There was a bonus even further downstream. Because the rock dams let Campbell grow spring hay on stored soil moisture, he didn't need to divert as much water for irrigation early in the summer. He owns the water rights in that valley, so he could simply let the water keep flowing past. Downstream, ranchers started noticing more water in the river. Water that used to rip through in the spring flood and be gone was now being handed down the line, slowed just enough to be useful. One valley's restoration became several ranchers' water supply. So is this the miracle cure for every dry creek in the West? Here's where the story earns your trust by admitting what it isn't. It's not magic, and it's not universal. This works because of specific conditions. You need the right gradient, so the water slows without blowing the structures out. You need the right kind of sediment and soil for the water to soak into. You need those old riparian soils and seed banks still hiding underground, waiting. You need a landowner willing to experiment, maintain the structures, and wait. Drop rock in the wrong creek, in the wrong place, near the wrong infrastructure, and you'll get a mess instead of a meadow. The reason this story is believable is precisely that it doesn't work everywhere. And there's one more limit, and it's almost darkly funny. Campbell's biggest fight wasn't with the desert. It was with paperwork. Because he'd never gotten a permit to put rock in those channels. Normally you'd need one, but his ranch sits in the northern Great Basin, land that drains internally and never reaches the ocean, so the streams don't fall under federal jurisdiction. They're waters of the state of Oregon, under a state permit program. And that program tied itself in a knot. When Campbell started, the rules said you needed a permit for a perennial stream, one that flows year-round, or an intermittent stream with ocean-going fish. Camp Creek was neither. It was a dry wash with no fish, so no permit needed. But after his rocks turned it into a year-round stream full of fish, now it was a perennial fish-bearing stream, exactly the kind that needs a permit. He'd created the thing that made his own past work illegal. The restoration only required a permit if it succeeded. He ended up paying fines for work already done and even pushing for state legislation just to keep restoring his own land. Think about that. The The system punished him for fixing it. But the water is still there. The grass is still there. The fish are still there. The fire still stopped at the green line. So step back and look at what actually happened in this valley. For 100 years, everyone accepted the sagebrush and the dry gullies as the natural face of eastern Oregon. It looked normal because no living person remembered anything else. But it was never natural. It was a wound. It was a machine that had been running for 10,000 years with one part quietly removed, and the part was an animal. When people pulled the beaver, the water followed it out. And when a retired pet doctor put a crude, patient imitation of that animal back into the creek, the water came back too. He didn't out-engineer the land. He didn't build a dam a firm would sign off on. He didn't drill wells or truck in water or pour concrete. He found the one place the system was broken, propped it open with rock, and let 100 years of buried seeds and sleeping springs do the rest. There are more of these stories than you'd think, hiding in plain sight, where the answer everyone mocked as too cheap or too crude turned out to be the only thing that fit. If you want us to chase another one, tell us where to look. Because the lesson here isn't that nature is fragile. The lesson is stranger and more hopeful than that. This valley wasn't dead, it was waiting. And the most powerful machine in that whole broken landscape was never the engineering the experts wanted. It was the one that used to be alive, rebuilt in stone by the one man stubborn enough to read why it had left. The creek didn't come back because someone finally overpowered it. It came back because someone finally stopped it from losing what it already had.